Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. Kicking off today's video is a flight story that proves karma doesn't always need turbulence to hit hard. But before we begin, best way to support our channel is to leave comments, like, and subscribe with a turned-on bell so you don't miss the new video every single day. Here we go. He ignored every warning, then learned why you never steal a seat on a plane. Last week, I took a flight from Athens, where I'd been visiting relatives, to London. It was a late flight, I was exhausted, and the plane was full. I was in a window seat, which I'd chosen so I could rest my head against the walls and sleep, but when I got to my row, there was a guy in my seat. He had big headphones on and had his head turned away from me. I tried telling him that he's in my seat. He doesn't respond, thinking maybe he can't hear me because of the headphones. I gently tap him on the shoulder, no reaction. I try again, still nothing. He doesn't even turn towards me. Edited to add that he's clearly not asleep. He's sitting upright and I can see his eyes are open. I considered calling over a flight attendant to ask him to move, but there isn't one nearby and I'm not in the mood for it to be a whole thing, so I just take the middle seat and quietly fume. A few minutes later, the young woman who's sitting in the aisle seat arrives and takes her seat. She's traveling with her friend who's sitting in the window seat in the row behind us. They're talking to each other across their seats. Then the woman sitting in the aisle seat turns to me and asks if I can swap with her friend so they can sit together. I say sure, no problem. Now at this point, it's important to point out that her friend is very fat, borderline obese. Not fat shaming, I'm a heavy guy myself, but she's at least twice as wide as me. I probably would have swapped even if she hadn't been fat, but I saw a chance at revenge. As I get up to move, I see the guy sitting in my seat is turned around and realize what's about to happen. He doesn't look happy and gives me a look like he's saying, please don't move. I ignore him and swap seats. I spent the flight mostly with my eyes closed as I try, and fail, to get a nap, but I do occasionally have a look at the row in front of me, and am very satisfied to see that the fat woman in front of me is taking up nearly half of the window seat as well as her own seat, and that the guy in my seat is squashed up against the wall of the plane. I hope he spent the flight thinking about how if he'd just taken his own seat, he'd have been able to swap with the fat woman, and I'd have been the one pinned against the wall. Maybe next time he'll think twice before he takes someone else's seat. Should have bought her drinks the whole flight. Only thing worse than being crushed by an overweight seatmate is being crushed by a drunk and obnoxious overweight seatmate. And our second story. My grandmother's ex-husband blamed her for only having daughters. This is my grandmother's petty revenge, but it's too good not to share. It's the kind of long game revenge that only life itself can deliver, and my grandmother just sat back and watched the universe do its thing. So my grandfather, who I've never met, divorced my grandmother right after she gave birth to her second daughter. They had married young, lived in a super conservative town where everyone's business was everyone's business, and he was obsessed with having a son, like emotionally unstable level obsessed. When my grandmother didn't produce a boy, he treated it as a personal betrayal. After the second daughter arrived, he bailed, divorced her, blamed her, and because this town was stuck somewhere between 1890 and a bad church newsletter, she was the one ostracized. She had failed as a wife. He apparently was a poor victim of biology that he didn't understand. Not long after the divorce, he married his second wife, like within months, practically speed-running matrimony. My grandmother, meanwhile, stayed long enough to save up money so she could get herself and her daughters out of that miserable town. But even after she left, she kept tabs on what was happening back home, partially because she still had family there, and partially because, well, sometimes karma deserves an audience. And then the universe delivered its first punchline. Wife number 2 gave birth to a girl. He didn't take the hint. Wife number 3, also a girl. But here's where the long-term karmic comedy becomes glorious. My grandfather ultimately had 5 wives, including my grandmother, and every single one gave birth to girls. Wife number 2 had 3 girls. Wife number 3 had 2 girls and 1 stillborn. Wife number 4 had 3 girls. Wife number 5 had 1 daughter and then divorced him almost immediately because she didn't want to be blamed for failing to give him a boy. She saw the writing on the wall. Even better, somewhere along this mess, it came out that he'd cheated with a neighbor who ended up having 3 boys and 1 girl. Turns out the 1 girl was actually his. The neighbor's husband divorced her, rightfully furious, but she refused to marry my grandfather because, and I quote, he's defective. That quote alone could fuel me emotionally for years. So now this man who strutted around acting like women were the problem is paying a fortune in child support, has a trail of ex-wives behind him, and can't find a woman willing to marry him. Shocking, I know, but it turns out 20-something women aren't lining up to marry a 68-year-old man with a long track record of blaming everyone but himself. And here's the extra twist of irony. That very conservative, very judgmental town that once publicly shamed my grandmother for not producing a boy, they've since updated their tune. Now they're supportive of his daughters and his divorces. Apparently in 2025, they finally learned the basic biology lesson that it's the man who determines the baby's sex. The entire situation was one long karmic slap in the face delivered in installments over decades, and my grandmother never had to lift a finger. Meanwhile, she went on to remarry a wonderful man and eventually had my uncle, a healthy baby boy. Her relatives back in the old town, they loudly celebrated how blessed she was for finally giving birth to a son. The same relatives who once whispered about her supposed failure. All she had to do was smile politely and enjoy the sound of cosmic justice ringing like a church bell. Sometimes the universe does the petty revenge for you. Your grandmother quietly rebuilt her life, remarried, and created a healthy family environment while he churned through relationships without ever seeing the common denominator. Every outcome he feared, all daughters, no male heir, social fallout, came not from bad luck, but from refusing to learn. And the moment biology was understood by the very community that once criticized your grandmother, the entire narrative shifted back in her favor. It's remarkable how cleanly the long-term consequences lined up. And our next story. The vegan feast that fooled the family carnivore. I'm going to start this off by saying I love cooking for people. My personal philosophy is that no matter what your situation, your restrictions, or your tastes, you should be able to eat good food. Good, enjoyable food. I've written cookbooks for my past friends who had dietary problems, allergies, or diagnoses that deprived them of some of their favorites. Everyone needs to eat, and I've learned that the culinary science around finding these substitutions or alternatives is my niche. I love it. And now the victim, my brother. My very opinionated brother, let's call him Dan, believes that any meal without meat is a waste of time. This is a guy who will crack open a Mountain Dew, a can of beans, and a few jerky sticks and call it a meal. He even told me that, and I'm quoting here, veganism and vegetarianism is hippie, frou-frou rabbit food and shouldn't be considered real lifestyles. On one hand, I get it when you're talking to the holier-than-thou types, but there are some people who genuinely need those restrictions to have a decent quality of life. One of them is my brother-in-law, who I'll call Tim. He's an absolute ray of sunshine. I love cooking for Tim. Figuring out the alternatives for some of my typical ingredients has allowed me to make dairy-free sauces and ice creams, and I even figured out a recipe for chocolate mousse that even my kids go nuts for. When egg prices went up, I had 3 substitutes in my cabinet to get through a rough patch in our finances, and when a member of my immediate family became lactose intolerant due to a medicine mishap, since fixed, I had non-dairy ingredients on hand to make the transition as smooth as possible. So when my siblings all arranged to get together for Memorial Day weekend, I insisted it be held at my house, and I cooked for everybody. I was going to grill for everyone without any dairy or meat products. The only exception was going to be the burgers, but literally everything else was going to be completely vegan. The buns, the creamy mushroom sauce, the marinade for the veggie skewers, the butter for the corn cobs, the garlic dip, even the frickin' homemade ice cream, strawberry flavored for those curious. And yes, I made my own strawberry syrup for the ice cream. Literally the only non-vegan item was the burgers. And Dan ate it all. Dan literally told me it was the best burger he'd ever had. Loved the ice cream, even took the mushroom sauce home. He was shocked the ice cream didn't mess with his stomach like the last ice cream he had. Unrelated to the med issue. I still haven't told him. He probably won't talk to me ever again if I do, so I'm keeping this to myself for now, while laughing about it. Let's see how many meals I can host before he notices. Start a photo album of him enjoying all the vegan dishes, accompanied by the recipe for each. Dedicate the cookbook to him, and gift him the first signed copy, paired with the photo album. And our last story. A neighbor cut down 50 of my parents' trees to steal a mountain view. Tree law cost them $227,000 and their home. One quiet morning, my parents woke up to what looked at first like the aftermath of a storm. Branches everywhere, leaves scattered across the lawn. But the longer they stood there, the quieter the morning felt, almost wrong. Then they realized why. Dozens of trees were missing, nearly 50 of them. Some of the smaller ones had only their tops hacked off, as if someone had run out of energy halfway through the job. But the older trees that had been there for 60, 70 years, had been cut clean to the ground. Whoever did it tried to hide their crime by leaning the felled trunks against standing trees and covering the stumps with piles of rocks and branches. This wasn't random destruction, this was deliberate. And the why became painfully obvious the moment my parents looked across the property line. The only section of trees that had been cut down formed a perfect, uncluttered corridor aimed directly toward one particular neighbor's house. A neighbor who had long complained about not having a decent mountain view. Now, thanks to someone's chainsaw, they suddenly had a panoramic one. A view they never paid for, a view that came at the cost of my parents' property. The trees weren't just decoration, they blocked noise from the semi-major road behind them. They shielded the yard from headlights at night and bikes on the path below. They provided privacy, shade, and natural protection from wind. Losing them wasn't just aesthetic, it fundamentally changed the environment around the home my parents had cared for over 35 years. The shock wore off quickly. Anger settled in. I told them to take photos of everything, wide shots, close shots, stump measurements, the hacked-off top still lying scattered. They called the sheriff, who came out, looked around, and shrugged that it was a misdemeanor property crime. Since it happened on private land, there wasn't much he could do. But tree law doesn't care about sheriff shrugging. They made an appointment with an arborist, a highly respected local one, to assess the full replacement cost. When he showed up, he spent nearly 2 hours documenting the damage. Then he gave a number that stunned even my parents, $227,000. That was the estimated cost of replacing every tree with one of comparable size and maturity, and he made it very clear he would testify. Armed with the report, photographs, and legal precedent, my parents filed a civil claim, and that's when the fun started. The neighbor who had loudly insisted for years that the trees didn't even need to be there pretended to have no idea what happened. Yet, mysteriously, new patio furniture appeared on their deck, perfectly angled toward the freshly opened mountain view. They also attempted to tell other neighbors that the city must have cut them down. Unfortunately for them, the city had no record of such an order. And one more thing, the HOA's landscaper reported that the same neighbor had been asking about removing nuisance trees for months. The case moved forward. Once confronted with potential liability for well over $200,000, legal fees, and additional damages, the neighbor's confident attitude crumbled. They tried to settle quietly for a fraction. My parents refused. Weeks later, their attorney delivered the news. The neighbor, now panicked about the escalating case and the possibility of liens, had agreed to a major settlement, enough to reforest the entire property, install professional sound barrier landscaping, and cover every legal fee. The HOA, they added an amendment requiring written permission from all adjoining owners before any vegetation removal, and quietly removed the neighbor from the landscaping committee. But the final consequence came a little later. When word spread that the neighbor had illegally destroyed protected trees, the county fined them separately. Not criminally, but financially enough to hurt. And because the property was part of the HOA's shared use corridor, their premiums skyrocketed. Eventually, facing community backlash, legal bills, and higher fees, the neighbor put their house on the market. The same open view they destroyed the trees to get, now enjoyed by prospective buyers touring the home they could no longer afford to stay in. My parents' trees are being replanted this spring, every last one, paid for entirely by the person who tried to steal the view. The neighbor wanted a mountain view, and instead of purchasing a property with one, they tried to manufacture it by cutting down trees that didn't belong to them. They gambled on the assumption that no one would pursue it or that the damages would be minimal. Instead, they ended up paying for the reforestation, the legal work, and the fallout within the community. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.